Computer scientist Shwetak Patel and his team are developing new sensing systems.
The initial focus was really around energy and water monitoring.
They built a new generation of smart sensors that monitor electronic interference on a home's power line or water pressure changes in the plumbing. Most of this technology has already found industrial applications, and Patel and his team turned their attention to adapting the technology for personal health monitoring.
So how do we take this noise and make it into a signal of interest was kind of the core of what we did for many years, and we're taking that work and applying it to other domains.
They're looking to take advantage of all the functionality built into our smartphones. With the user's permission, this app can use the microphone built into most smartphones to listen to background noises, such as coughing, searching for patterns that suggest a trip to the doctor might be in order.
We construct these models that try and understand how sound works, what its patterns are, and we give it a whole bunch of examples of different kinds of audio, things like people talking, things like people laughing, sneezing, and of course coughing.
This app uses a phone's camera to check hemoglobin levels in blood by analyzing the color of capillary fluids through the skin.
Generally, what happens is if you're anemic, your blood's going to be a little less red. And we take advantage of that by putting your finger over a camera of a phone. The camera of the phone can actually see the coloration of the blood.
And this test uses the camera to help parents worried about jaundice in newborn infants.
Now, jaundice is something that doctors who have seen tons of babies can just kind of figure out on a very basic level of, is this baby, do they need to get treatment, or are they in a good condition? Whereas a first-time parent has no idea necessarily what jaundice might look like.
The researchers say the built-in sensors found in smartphones are already commonplace, but their applications and their implications for our health and well-being may be more far-reaching than we ever imagined.
The Earth's temperature is rising, and as it does, springtime phenomena, like the first bloom of flowers, are getting earlier and earlier. But rising temperatures aren't the only factor. Urban light pollution is also quickening the coming of spring.
So temperature and light are really contributing to a double whammy of making everything earlier.
Richard French-Constant, an entomologist at the University of Exeter. He and his colleagues compiled 13 years of data from citizen scientists in the UK who tracked the first bud burst of 4 common trees. And it turns out light pollution from streetlights in cities and along roads pushed bud burst a full week earlier, way beyond what rising temperatures could achieve. This disruptive timing can ripple through the ecosystem.
The caterpillars that feed on trees are trying to match the hatching of their eggs to the timing of bud bursts, because the caterpillars want to feed on the juiciest and least chemically protected leaves. And it's not just the caterpillars, of course, that are important, but the knock-on effect is on nesting birds, which are also trying to hatch their chicks at the same time that there's the maximum number of caterpillars.
So earlier buds could ultimately affect the survival of birds and beyond. The findings are in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. The world's becoming increasingly urbanized, and light pollution is growing, which French-Constant says could trick trees into budding earlier and earlier. But smarter lighting, like LEDs that dial down certain wavelengths, could help.
Perhaps the exciting thing is that if we understand more about how light affects this bud burst, that we might be able to devise smarter sort of street lighting that has less red components and therefore less early bud burst.
Thus keeping springtime an actual springtime phenomenon.
We can ask two fundamental questions about animal behaviour. They're referred to as proximate and ultimate. Proximate questions are those concerned with the mechanisms that bring about behaviour. Ultimate questions are those concerned with the evolution of behaviour. We can divide the proximate and ultimate questions into two sub-questions. For proximate, how does the behaviour develop? And secondly, what causes the behaviour? For ultimate, we can ask, how did the behaviour evolve? And secondly, what is the adaptive significance of the behaviour? What's its purpose? Together, these comprise what are called Tinbergen's 4 questions about animal behaviour. Nico Tinbergen was one of the founding fathers of the study of animal behaviour. These questions represent the different ways of studying animal behaviour. And understanding the difference between those 4 questions are fundamental to understanding behaviour and indeed the whole of biology. How do we study animal behaviour? Well, that depends on the type of question we're hoping to answer.
When you think of a leader, you may think of an individual who is, above all, bold. But a new study of fish called sticklebacks shows that shy individuals actually prefer to follow fish that are similarly timid. Researchers had trios of sticklebacks with known personalities play follow the leader. The fish were placed in a tank that had some plastic plants at one end and some food hidden at the other. In some of the groups, a bold fish and a shy fish acted as leaders, while another shy fish followed. And in other groups, it was a bold fish that did the following. The researchers recorded whether the follower sallied forth more frequently with the fish that was behaviorally similar or the one that was different. What they found is that shy fish were more likely to emerge from under cover when an equally wary fellow was already out there. Bold follower fish did not seem to care as much which leader they followed. Of course, no matter which fish a stickleback chose to stick with, the bold fish did lead more joint expeditions over the course of the experiment than their more retiring friends. That's because the bold fish initiated more trips, regardless of who might be tailing them. The findings are in the journal Biology Letters. The researchers write that when offered a choice of leaders, sticklebacks prefer to follow individuals whose personality matches their own. But bolder individuals may, nevertheless, be able to impose their leadership, even among shy followers, simply through greater effort. We may soon see if such tendencies also hold true in humans when Americans decide who they'll follow in November, unless, of course, something fishy happens.
Here are three important factors in creativity: people, process, and product. The most important one is the process. First, you have to create the right person through education with a creative mind. Second, you have to create the right process to have people engaged in the innovation process. Third, you need to find the right problem to work on. Human beings can survive and prosper largely depending on the creativity they have. If you identify and assess the creativity of a finished product, it is taken as a proxy for the creativity of the person who produced such a product. Therefore, a creative product should be surprising, original, beautiful, and useful. People should have factors necessary for genius, ability, and the right mindset. You should improve to imitate and change insight. Look from new perspectives. Innovately create something with imagination to expand the conceptual spaces.
There's sugar in a lot of foods where you don't expect it. And of course, there's lots of sugar in donuts or ice cream or pastries or other things that are sweet, candy of course. But there are other places where you see it and you don't necessarily expect it. So as an example, peanut butter. Here's a list of ingredients from Skippy peanut butter, and you see that sugar is the second most common ingredient. Excuse me, you may know from reading food labels that these ingredients in any food label are listed in order of how much there is in the food itself. So sugar comes right after peanuts. Here's another example, beef stew. You wouldn't necessarily expect to find sugar in beef stew, but it's there. Now it's down the list of ingredients. It's actually toward the end. But if you look at the marketing of this and look at the can, it says there's fresh potatoes and carrots, but actually there's more sugar in this than there is carrots. And so you wouldn't eat something like beef stew and expect to find this to be the case.
So when we talk about the polar regions, just to clarify exactly what we mean, we have first of all the Arctic at the top of the Earth and the Antarctic at the bottom. So the Arctic was named after the Greek word for bear. Now surprisingly it's not after the polar bears that live in the Arctic, but it's after the Little and Great Bear constellations that can be seen in the sky. Now the Greeks also hypothesized that there would be an anti-Arctic, which is how we get the name Antarctica. But of course it wasn't discovered until much later on. Now these regions are opposite in many ways other than just their names and their location on the globe. So if we look at the Arctic first of all, the Arctic is actually ocean surrounded by land. So we can see here, this is the UK down here, and this is kind of Russia, and then America and Canada around here. So there is a bit of land covered in ice in the Arctic, which is Greenland here. But mostly all this area here, surprisingly a lot of people don't realise that this isn't actually land. The North Pole isn't on land, it's just one big ocean.
Why should we bother studying animal behaviour? Well, first and foremost, because we're interested in understanding why animals do what they do. There are lots of other reasons for studying animal behaviour. Conservation biologists need to know what animals do if they're going to save them. Are those animals social or solitary? How much space do they need? And how many mates do they have? Sometimes you can't predict the outcome of research. Fernando Nottebohm started out being interested in how birds know what to sing. Yet his research eventually led to a complete overhaul of the entire field of neurobiology, a totally unanticipated yet utterly monumental effect. And this is the course textbook by John Alcock. The fact that this is in its 9th edition tells you how vast a field animal behaviour is. There's lots of new developments.
So, what do we mean by well-being? Health, happiness, a sense of achievement and contentment, a state of mind and body where people can thrive. Well-being is not something that is purely limited to people who are facing extraordinary challenges in their lifestyle, health, or personal circumstances. Everybody here has a level of well-being. Music so often forms an intuitive part of our well-being management. Music to pick us up, music to calm us down, music to heal our sorrows. Our aim, through research, is to move from this level of intuitive application of music through to informed use in our communities, to take the next step in the understanding of the power of music in human life. Music already works for us on so many levels, whether it's soothing and teaching our infants, bringing people and communities together, adding spirit to our work and personal endeavours. But there is no reason to stop here.
This is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you hear the term robot, but I'm going to show you the very, very first robots. These were the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots. And the play was written by a Czech writer called Karel Čapek. And basically, these robots, you know, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute, cuddly toys or, you know, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War, you know, finished. That had a devastating impact across Europe. And so people were kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human, what makes us human, those kind of questions. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to kind of write this play. And interestingly, these robots being human, they are actually in the play assembled on a production line, a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. So even though they are human, they are assembled, and these robots are designed to labour, and that is their primary purpose in society.
Now the economists calculated, it's a back-of-the-envelope calculation, that removing all immigration controls would double the size of the world economy, and even a small relaxation of immigration controls would lead to disproportionately big gains. Now from an ethical point of view, it's hard to argue against a policy that will do so much to help people that are much poorer than ourselves. The famous RAND study reckons that a typical immigrant who arrives in the US ends up with $20,000 a year. That's rough. It's not just the migrants themselves who gain, it's the countries they come from. Already, the migrants from poor countries working in rich countries send home around $200 billion a year through formal channels, and about twice as that through informal channels. And that compares to the need $100 million that Western governments give in aid. These remittances are not wasted on weapons or siphoned off into Swiss bank accounts, they go straight into the pockets of local people. They pay for food, clean water and medicines, they help kids in school, they help start up new business.
Some adverse effects of climate changes change agricultural production. Some lands are just merely unsuitable for growing crops. There will be millions of people facing hunger in Africa in the near future. Climate change will result in less production and less food. It is difficult for developing countries to deal with climate change due to their financial status and other issues. There are many people living in hunger, especially in Africa. The climate change has devastating effects on world economy. The tropical areas on Earth are dry and hot, and are originally not suitable for food production. The change of climate leads to extreme weather conditions such as floods and hurricanes, which exacerbates the food production issues. As a result, it leads to a continuous decline in food supply annually, around 10 to 17%. And this trend is perceived to be continuing in the future. By 2017, the region suffering the most will be some African countries.
Australia's location is important for the world's exports, and its international trade is also important. Since Australia has a large territory with vast, uninhabited areas, all towns are scattered around. This leads to huge expenses for transportation when using trains and ferries. The government also has to pay large amounts for its telecommunications to build up the catching between these regions. The Australian people are mainly living in 5 cities: Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, and Brisbane, and Adelaide. The most special one is Perth, which is one of the most isolated cities in the world. However, this does not affect its state to be one of the largest cities in Australia. Most large companies, like the 2 leading companies, Telstra and Qantas, they are both based in Perth.
So that creates tensions, and that's what I want to talk about, because I think it's important that we are, as a society, able to have an informed debate about how much privacy is enough but not too much, how much security is enough but not too much. Privacy is a human right. That's simply quoting the Universal Declaration. In the physical world, we've got all kinds of protections. This is evidence that we care about our privacy. We've got doors, we've got obscured glass, we've got locks, we wear clothes, we put up shutters. And technology continues to erode the privacy that exists in the real world, in the three spatial dimensions. Security cameras, automatic number plate recognition take away anonymity. Long lenses, paparazzi, take away distance and the privacy that used to create. And body scanners are increasingly being used to see through clothes, for example. This process isn't going to slow down, and the new quantum technologies are actually being able to do gravitational sensing, and that's advancing at a remarkable rate, and you can't shield gravity. So some of the new quantum technologies are able already to see through walls, and there are technologies also for seeing around corners now using scattered light from lasers. Technology continues to erode privacy.
Very first tutorial in biology. Now, in this video series, what I want to do is I want to talk to you guys about many different topics concerning biology. For example, I want to talk to you guys about DNA and genetics and cells and bacteria and life and a whole bunch of interesting stuff. But since this is the very first video, I think what we should do in this video is just stick with the very basics. And the first thing I want to do is talk to you guys about what is biology. So let's go ahead and answer that question, and the definition of biology is this: the study of life and living organisms. Alright, that makes sense up to a certain point, up until organisms, because you may have heard of organisms before, and you may have your own definition, but the scientific definition of an organism is a living thing. Well, that's easy. We know what living things are. I'm a living thing. Plants, grass is a living thing. My puppy, named Old Dan, cutest puppy ever, by the way, is a living thing. But whenever we talk about living things, believe it or not, things get kind of complicated, because then you have to ask yourself, what is life? Well, of course, if you ask your grandma or your best friend, or even if you ask a philosopher, what is life? Everyone is going to give you kind of a different definition of their outlook on life. However, whenever scientists and biologists were first deciding, you know what is life? That's the problem that they had. Everyone had their own separate definition of life itself. So what they needed to do before biology was even invented, which is of course the study of life, is scientists needed to agree on the definition of life.